We are going to be talking about export controls, responsible conduct of research, conflicts of interest and commitment, and some foreign influence. My name is Lauren Douglas, and I will be doing the export controls and RCR portions of this. And if you have any questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat, or you can wait and I'll take questions when I get to the end of the RCR part. Okay, so this is a lot of information. And the key things that we want to focus on here are what are export controls, like what is an export? And the second major thing is what is a deemed export? So export controls is going to be all of the laws and regulations that govern transmitting or transporting information, items, technologies, and services to foreign countries or to foreign persons. And what is an export is any item, commodity, technology, or software that is sent out of the US to a foreign destination. And this can be done by mailing something, by hand carrying something in your luggage on an airplane. In some cases, it can be providing of services to people like military training or something along those lines. The other key thing you want to take from the slide is what is a deemed export. And a deemed export is when there is the transfer of export controlled information or technology behind an export controlled item to a foreign person while in the United States. And so how could this happen? This could happen through just a conversation that someone is having with a foreign national that would include proprietary information behind an export controlled item. It could happen by emailing technical specifications about something to a foreign national in the United States. It could even happen in some cases of just a person walking through a laboratory and seeing a particular item. Some items are even controlled from being able to be seen by foreign nationals. So an export is something leaving the US going to a foreign country. A deemed export is export controlled information going to a foreign national in the US. Export control regulations, all those laws and rules and regulations, all of those things apply to both exports and deemed exports. And the other thing to keep in mind on here is when we're talking about exporting something, it is going to apply to both tangible items like the chair that you're sitting in, the pen that you're holding, the computer that you're using. It applies to all of those things. And it also applies to intangible things, like I said, like an email of some technological or technical specifications for an item, software for an export controlled item, something that is not necessarily a thing that is related to an export controlled item. Some things to keep in mind on this are that US origin items and technology are still subject to US export control laws, even if they're not in the US. So if you have sent an export controlled item to a colleague in Germany and they want to send it to someone in France, they can't just send it to France. They may still have to get a license from the government to send that US origin item from Germany to France. And then another thing to keep in mind is that even when something is available commercially or worldwide, export control laws still apply to it. Well, they still apply to it, but there may still need to be a license required for them. All right, my next super busy slide for you. The key thing to take from this slide is the three big regulators of items. So the heavy hitter is the Department of State, and they are known as the DDTC, or the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. Their regulations, their entire thing, all of their rules and regs is known as the ITAR, and it's the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And then as part of the ITAR, there is a specific list called the United States Munitions List, and that list covers all of the military and defense article items. It's going to regulate all the goods and technology and software and services that are designed to kill or defend against death. So these are war things. Additionally, it includes space-related technology because of missiles. And so just as the fourth bullet point is just a reminder, this includes technical data. So it's not just guns, bombs, rockets. It's not just those things or even, infrared cameras and things like that. It's also going to be technology, software, and data related to those articles that are also covered. The next one we want to talk about is the Department of Commerce, and that is the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. And that is where I spend the majority of my time. Their regulations are called the Export Administration Regulations, and their specific list is called the Commerce Control List, or the CCL. The CCL is very large. It's a very, very long document, and it regulates items, commodities, software, and technologies that can be used for commercial purposes as well as defense applications. So these guys are kind of known as dual use technologies. As a reminder, it covers both the goods or the items as well as the technology and the software behind them. And finally, the third big player of this is the Department of Treasury through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And this is kind of the economic arm of the export control regs. These are going to be embargoes and sanctions on restricted entities. They have multiple lists, and they basically regulate what kind of activities can occur with people and entities on these lists. So in some cases, nothing can be done. If you're on their list, then people in the US cannot do business with you. They impose trade sanctions and embargoes and economic sanctions. And the reason that they're a key player is because as a US person, we're prohibited from providing payments or providing services or things of value to certain individuals or certain sanctioned countries or certain entities. And so we have to screen people to make sure that they're not on one of their lists and that we aren't prohibited from doing business with them. All right, so there are consequences of export control violations. And I don't include this slide because I think that you would necessarily get a question about what those consequences would be. But I include this slide as a kind of notice or a reminder that there are consequences of export control violations and that they extend to not only the university or the corporation, but also to the individuals, and that they can be pretty hefty. And so it is important for research things to go through an export control review so that we're not faced with these consequences. So let's go into how export control review is integrated into a university setting. So these are some examples of where an export control review is required from a university setting. So any international travel, so whether you're going to a conference, whether you're going to collaborate with someone, whether you're going to do field work for your IRB or your IACUG study, if you're traveling internationally, an export control review needs to be done. If you are shipping or hand carrying anything outside of the US, including international waters, an export control review needs to be done. Some sponsors will include export controlled information as part of their sponsored project, and an export control review would need to be done then for sure. Any collaborations with foreign persons or entities needs to be reviewed. When a research lab or a facility is going to be toured by foreign persons, or just if they have sensitive items or technology in that lab, an export control review should be done. And then if you're providing services or anything of value to an embargoed or sanctioned country. And so an example of something like this would be there are like core labs, or there are service labs on campus that do things like analyze blood, analyze urine, genetic sequence things, or provide sequence analysis of things. And so they will do that for hire. And so we have to be sure that we are not providing that service for someone or an entity or in a country that is embargoed or sanctioned. So basically, what it boils down to is all international activities and interactions and all research projects involving controlled information items or technology have an export control review requirement. So there are some exclusions from the regulations. And so research and teaching can be exempt from export control regulations under these three main exclusions: the fundamental research exclusion, educational information exclusion, and the public information exclusion. We're going to talk about the fundamental research exclusion in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. But I'm just pointing out that there are some exclusions, and we'll talk about them in some more detail on the next slide. But I just wanted to point out for this, on this slide, that the university has to demonstrate and document that an export control review was performed in order to claim this exemption. So it can't just be an investigator saying, oh yeah, my research is fundamental research, there's no export control review. Our office would still need to review the material because there are some pretty interesting regulations out there. All right, so let's talk about those three exclusions in a little bit more detail. The fundamental research exclusion is going to apply to basic and applied research in science and engineering. The main things about this is that the results need to be intended to be published and shared broadly within the scientific community. And also, there can be no restrictions on publications. There can be no restrictions on the participation of foreign nationals. And there can't be any specific national security controls on the research or the results, meaning there's not some sort of sponsor thing going on there. The education information exclusion is going to apply to information that's commonly taught in the classroom. So this is going to be something that is advertised in a catalog course or through an associated lab, like a chem lab, and it does not apply to like capstone projects or research or design projects. And then the other exclusion applies to information that's already published. So if it is in a book, a newspaper, a pamphlet, if it is on a website that anyone can look at, if it is presented at a conference that's going to have the conference proceedings, or if it's something that's publicly available, that is considered to be in the public domain, and the public information exclusion would apply to that. It would not necessarily be considered export controlled. I do want to point out that these exclusions only apply to results or information. None of these exclusions apply to physical items. So physical items, say, for example, a specific kind of microscope. There is no exclusion here that's going to apply to that particular item. The item is still going to be export controlled and will still have some sort of management plan on it if it is highly controlled. Okay, so the fundamental research exclusion is something that you'll run into the most. So I wanted to give just a teensy bit more detail about it. The fundamental research exclusion is void, meaning it does not apply if the contract, the sponsored project, is accepted with publication restrictions or restrictions on the participation of foreign nationals. If either of those two things are present, then it can no longer meet the fundamental research exclusion, and there will be some sort of export control management plan that needs to be put in place. And the reason I bring this up is because there are a lot of clauses that impose these types of restrictions. Usually really helpful to negotiate those clauses out, but sometimes they cannot necessarily be negotiated out, or they truly do apply. And in which case that project is going to need to be on a TCP or some sort of management plan, or it may require an export control license. And it will take additional time to get those things set up. So when at all possible, fundamental research exclusion is great. Sometimes it is not possible, and that's why we keep an eye out for these particular clauses which negate that fundamental research exclusion. All right, And so this is my last slide in the export controls section. I just wanted to give you an example of something that we do so you can kind of see how an export control review happens and what's required in it. So if someone wants to ship something outside of the US, there are some things that we have to consider. We have to consider what is it? What is its value? Who's going to access it? Who's going to use it? Who's going to maintain it or maintain custody of it? Is it a temporary export or is it coming back to the US? All items have an export control classification number or ECCN, and our office has to determine that. Typically, we work with the manufacturer of the product, but sometimes the manufacturer doesn't know, and we have to work with the traveler to identify what this item is classified as. We want to know where it's going, and we want to know how it will be used. And we have to answer all of these questions in order to determine, do we need a license? Can we use a license exception? And if we do need a license, then there's more steps to the process. But the other things that we're looking at are end use and end user. So what is it being used for and who is using it? And the reason that we're concerned about this is we want to make sure that the things couldn't be used as some sort of weapon or by a prohibited party, or that there would be no plans to divert or transfer the item to someone else or somewhere else. We also have to make sure that it's not going to a country that's under a US embargo or sanction. And there are tons of different considerations for tons of different countries. So it is a very large chart that we use from the government to make this analysis, to do this analysis. And then also, again, like with the end user, we have to basically screen people to make sure that they are not on a list that prohibits a US person from doing business with them. So that's why we do screenings. But these are the kind of questions that our office has to focus on to do an export control review for shipping something out of the US. But we use very similar questions on the other reviews we do for like travel or for collaborations or things of that matter or things of that nature. But that is my last slide on export controls. So many federal granting agencies require RCR training. And the big ones are NIH, NSF, and USDA NEFA. And the information on the slide is just taken from their websites on why they require RCR training. And then I also included that TAMU has an RCR training requirement as well. So let's talk about what those requirements are. NSF has a training requirement for all undergrad students, grad students, postdocs, faculty, and senior personnel who will be supported by that project. They don't require their training plans to be submitted in their proposals, but they are subject to review by the NSF upon request. Our institution requires that individuals with NSF funding complete city RCR training currently. The NSF has very recently updated their requirements, and now those RCR training requirements have to also include export control training and research security training. So we are in the process of figuring out how those requirements will be met for the NSF. USDA NEFA requires that program directors, faculty, undergrad students, grad students, postdocs, and any staff participating on the project must receive RCR training. And they encourage also this online city training course. For the NIH, theirs is a little bit more intense, but it's for a very specific list of grants and awards. And these are typically like training grants. And they require that all trainees, participants, and scholars receive a minimum of 8 hours of formal face-to-face instruction, at least once, but during each career stage and at least every 4 years. When someone is submitting one of these NIH grants, they are required to submit their training plan with their proposal, and the NIH will approve their training plan at that time. So our expectation is that people with NIH funding are doing their RCR training as they outlined to the NIH that they would be doing that. So those are the federal requirements. And then I know not everyone is from A&M, but it's important to note that there are university and institutional RCR requirements as well. And so at TAMU, all undergrad and grad students and postdocs participating in research are required to complete RCR training per our SAP. And we have a very specific set of requirements for who has to do training, what kind of training they have to do, and who is responsible for making sure that they have done that training. And so, like I said, I know you guys aren't all from TAMU, but it is important to note that there are other institutional requirements for RCR training. And so here are some of the subject matter areas that are covered, and you can read these. It's pretty basic how you would conduct research responsibly. You want to make sure that you are having responsible research data management, that you have an understanding of what research misconduct is, responsible authorship. Mentoring is a big one. Different compliance areas like human subjects, animal welfare, biosafety, scientific ethics, safe research environments. And then, like I mentioned before, export controls and research security are starting to become included in this required RCR training subject matter areas as well. And that is all I have as far as RCR training goes.
As Lauren said, our office is responsible for a lot of regulatory compliance. And so we are called the Research Security and Export Control Office because all of these things come straight from the feds down to us. And we are here to help research, but to mitigate any risks that might be associated. And so that's why we do the export control review on all these things. And at TAMU, we have a rule, all international things must undergo an export control review. And so we've got safeguards in place through all of our different systems to make sure that those types of things make it to our office and so that we can look at them and help mitigate any risks that we identify. Sponsored projects should not be funded until the export control review is completed, as well as the conflicts of interest review. And so, like I said, we are here to help. We don't want to stop things, but we just want to make sure that all the rules are followed and that the institution and the government and the PIs are all protected. So I am currently specializing in conflicts of interest. And so there are several different kinds of conflicts of interest. Really, conflict, I mean, we all know what that means. And it's just a clash between one's personal interests and their professional duties and responsibilities. When there is a conflict, it can affect someone's ability to be impartial. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong going on. And so these are some of the typical types of conflicts that we see. You might have a personal conflict of interest where it goes against your moral values to do something. If you are in a professional setting and you are in charge of promotions, but you know the person and you don't know that you can stay fair when you're doing their evaluation, then you would have a professional conflict of interest. The organization can possibly be in conflict. So, for example, this applies to procurement a lot of times. If you are someone who buys for your department, but your uncle is the owner of the company you're buying from, that could be a conflict. There are financial conflicts of interest that we look at, and these are typically payments and activities that come from an outside source, honorariums, consulting, business ownerships, those kinds of things that might impact your research and the research results. And then similar to organizational conflicts of interest and financial conflicts of interest, there are institutional conflicts of interest where the institution that you work for could potentially have ownership in IP or ownership in an outside entity that could prohibit unbiased results in research. So these are just some of the big ones. Okay, so according to the federal government, the conflict of interest, it can really be dangerous. Public safety is a concern, but granting agencies also want to make sure that their money is being spent in ways that produce valid research results. And so there are many ways that conflicts of interest are addressed in the federal regulations, but in this particular section, 200-112, it mandates that granting agencies address the potential for conflicts of interest and put procedures in place to mitigate any risks. So basically, each federal agency kind of has a way that they address that. And so either they're finalized already or they're in the process of developing them, which seems to be a constant thing. It's like road construction regulations are always under construction, right? But typically the regulations apply to individuals and institutions, and they both will face consequences if there are unmanaged conflicts that end up biasing the research. So different offices within each institution needs to work together to make sure that information is being shared. And individuals need to know the federal rules as well as the way their institution handles and implements those rules. So generally, the federal government requires that institutions have an up-to-date, written, and enforced conflict of interest policy. The policy has to be publicly available. There has to be training on conflicts of interest that is completed every 4 years or more often in certain circumstances, and that any flow through of COI to subrecipients is addressed as well. So on this slide, you can see that our publicly available system regulation 150103 is specific to financial conflicts of interest that might bias research results. And so we at TAMU apply this to all research, not just federally funded research. So every project that is funded will have a financial conflicts of interest review. There are also additional regulations related to human subjects, I should say human participants protections. And so we look at conflicts of interest and we manage that related to human participants as well. This regulation defines the general procedures required for the TAMU system members to identify, manage, and report financial conflicts of interest in research. And the purpose of this regulation is to protect the credibility and integrity of system researchers and staff, as well as member universities and agencies themselves, so that the public trust and confidence in research activities is maintained. To that end, this regulation adopts standards for the disclosure of financial interests and the management and reporting of FCOIs beyond that which is required by the federal government. The training is required every 4 years for investigators, and I will talk about that a little bit later in the slides. Anybody can take it at TAMU, but it's only required for certain populations. So some examples of actual or potential FCOI. So if you see a situation where a faculty member owns a business, but then they want to take some of their grant money and they want to subcontract from the business receives a grant and then they want to do some of the work through their resources at the university. That could be a conflict of interest. If the PI wants to be the PI of some research that he's doing at his company, but he also wants to be a PI on something that's related at the university, that could be seen as a conflict of interest. Serving as an executive or a managerial in a managerial capacity in an entity that does business with the university, or where the entity is closely related to one's field of research, could potentially cause a conflict. And again, just because something is related, it doesn't mean it's a conflict. And just because it's a conflict, it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of needing to be managed. So this is all part of the process, and why we review these things is so we can make those types of determinations. Some gifts could create a conflict. Anytime you have an outside job, you could potentially have a conflict. And then utilizing students, trainees, or other university employees in your private business or consulting activities could create a conflict as well. So these are things we see all the time. So according to each agency, there are things that you have to tell them about. So either when you're submitting a proposal or to your university, but then, lets the federal agency know about the disclosure. You do have to tell some things. And so TAMU uses Huron. That's the way we accept disclosures. We used to do it through Maestro, but every institution does it a little bit differently. And so in the old way, in the Maestro system, we just simply asked, do you have anything that you need to disclose to us? And to a fault, people said no. And so we realized that wasn't really very efficient, and it wasn't getting us the information that the federal government was requiring and putting us all at risk. And so we have expanded the disclosure process in Huron. And so we need to make sure that we are gathering the information that they want. And so we have to be proactive, and we have to respond to the pressure that's being put upon us. And so the disclosure profile that we have houses a lot of specific questions about activities that are being asked by these federal agencies. And so it is also the system where we ask for approval for outside activities. So you can see up here that each one of them has similar definition of what needs to be disclosed, but they're slightly different, which of course complicates things for us, but we just have a minimal standard and we make sure that we are gathering as much information that we can. Reasonably related to the person's research is a kicker on this one, and so it is something to be keeping in mind as you are completing your disclosure if you work at TAMU, because everybody has to do one. And so, yes, you want to keep in mind reasonably related to your research. So again, it is, what do I have to tell you? What do I have to disclose? And significant financial interest is the term that is generally used when you're talking about what you have to tell the federal government about. And so at a minimum, investigators need to report this to the institution, and it should possibly go to granting agencies depending on the type of research that you do. If you are an investigator, then this information applies to your spouses and any dependent children or anybody that lives in your household and is on your tax return. You must talk about everything that you have earned or acquired in the previous 12 months, and you have to add everything together. So if you have equity in more than one company, you would add it all together and you would include that in one report. Typically, disclosures to the sponsors is done through the bio sketch, current and pending support, those kinds of forms when you are applying for the money. And so investigators must also disclose everything to their institution, and then the institution is responsible for what creates any conflict of interest. And again, keeping in mind that this is reasonably related to research. So you don't have to disclose that, grandma gave you a gift. You don't have to disclose that, you have a stock portfolio necessarily if it has nothing to do with your research topic. A lot of times people will say, well, I got a Christmas gift. Do I need to report that on my disclosure? No, you do not. Unless it's a microscope and you are using it in your research, something weird like that. That was a definition of what is significant financial interest. And so now I'm going to talk just a little bit about what is not significant financial interest. The federal government does not need to know about this, and the institution does not need to know about this. Your salary that you earn from your own institution is not anything that you need to disclose. You do not need to disclose that you received IP rights or any royalties if the system owns that IP. If you have IP that you generated from a previous employer and you still are receiving royalties from that, then yes, you would need to disclose. If you have mutual funds that are, not managed by you, you just have a person who manages the account for you, then you do not need to report that on your disclosure. There are some exceptions there for if you are working for a U.S. Teaching hospital, another research agency, that doesn't need to be reported. And if you get, the NSF pays you to travel on your grant to somewhere in the United States, we don't need to know about that. But so there's a sorting process that you need to think about when you are disclosing or when investigators are disclosing, and not everything has to go on the disclosure. Reasonably related still applies, but there are some things that just don't even have to be reported at all. Okay, so again, when we're looking at what the requirements are from each of the big federal agencies, you're going to notice that they define significant financial interest a little bit differently, but some of the things are standard across the board. And so we want to think about if it could potentially have an effect on either the design, conduct, or reporting of research. And so if it could potentially, whatever is disclosed, could potentially create some sort of effect on the design, conduct, or reporting, then conflict could be identified. And so again, you could have something that's related to your research and there's no conflict. You could have something that's related to your research and could potentially cause you to report the results differently. And so then you would be talking about something that is a conflict and it might need to be managed. So at TAMU, when we are looking at when we're doing reviews and we are looking at whether or not something creates a conflict of interest, you're thinking about whether or not those private financial interests compete with the professional obligations. And so it's not just a matter of true bias that could be created. If it's perceived that bias could be created, then we need to mitigate that also. And so if you know that if the 6 o'clock news found out something and it would look bad, then we need to take that into account when we are determining on our side whether or not a conflict of interest exists. And so at TAMU and pretty much as far as any institution goes, you would be looking at what was disclosed by the investigator and then looking at the specs related to the project or the study. And you would see, is this touching? Is there a relatedness between these two things? And then again, is this something that is going to have an impact on the research? And then it is up to the institution to determine if the conflict exists and whether or not it needs to be managed. So if we do determine that something needs to be managed, then we're responsible for developing some way to mitigate the risks that result. And so the regulation is written in such a way where it says that we have the responsibility to manage, reduce, or eliminate that conflict. And so sometimes just telling us about it is enough. So say a person has a business doing consulting on the side. They disclose the income that they make from that business on the side. And then each year they have to go to their supervisors and to faculty affairs and submit a form called a pre-approval request that says, hey, I have this consulting business on the side. As long as that consulting doesn't interfere with their research or touch their research, then we don't really need to do anything about it. Disclosure and permission were enough to mitigate the risk. However, if, like I said before, if the business that somehow gets a grant from the government and then wants to sub some of that to the PI at TAMU, then we start talking about how things are touching too much and there could be conflict that needs to be managed. So we will draft a management plan. And that lines out all of the rules and all of the oversight and all of the requirements that must be put in place and upheld during the project to make sure that even though these two things are related, there's no bias that will end up causing a problem with the research results. So funds should not be dispersed until the review is complete. Funds should not be dispersed until the management plan is implemented, or at least until our office says, okay, we're finalizing this. You can go ahead and set it up. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that we're not just allowing the money to start being spent until we have all the fences and boundaries put up to keep the research safe. Okay. So the question earlier about who has to take the training goes back to who does this apply to? So the federal government says you have to disclose. The federal government says, and then the institution has to decide if you need to manage it. But who has to do this? And so per the regulations from the feds, investigators, people who are considered investigators, and it is a defined term. And they, again, don't match identically, but they are very similar. And so for TAMU, we currently have expanded in our requirements for disclosure, and every TAMU employee must submit a disclosure annually, except if you are a collaborator, a consultant, a subcontractor, and those people are included, and then anyone who's key personnel on a proposal or on an award. And so what you will see on this one is that design, conduct, or reporting of research. And so we use that to help us decide if that's a conflict, but we also use that to determine who has to disclose. So anyway, investigators for TAMU's purposes are obviously the PIs, COIs, but we include in there graduate assistants. Anybody who's designing, conducting, or reporting has to do a financial conflict of interest disclosure. If you are a TAMU employee and you are not a researcher, you still have to do a disclosure, and the forms are a little bit different. We ask specifically about significant financial interest for investigators, we don't go into those questions if you are not a researcher. Additionally, as I mentioned before, if you are an investigator, you have to disclose and include information about your family members. If you are not a researcher, you do not. The system will determine which form you get. You don't have to worry about that. It is toggled in Maestro. But for the federal government, which if you are not a researcher and you are a TAMU employee, we're obviously not sending your disclosure to federal agencies. But if you are a researcher receiving federal dollars, it is very important that you know that a review needs to take place and that you do submit your disclosure. If you are a PI, you need to make sure that your grad students are marked FCOI investigators. And so then they will get the right form and we can conduct an FCOI review for them. Investigators must disclose within 30 days of their initial employment and then annually based on that date. I would say at least annually, because within 30 days of acquiring a new SFI, you need to update your disclosure. So it can be changed throughout the year. For an example, sponsored travel is considered significant financial interest and does need to be on your disclosure profile. You may or may not know how much is going to be reimbursed to you. Say you go to a conference and someone's going to pay you back for your travel expenses. You have 30 days after you return from your travel to get that added to your disclosure. So there's a little bit of a grace period. And then, as I mentioned, for certain federal sponsors, you have to have a disclosure on file before you can even submit your proposal. So in our institution, our office is monitoring disclosures continually, and we are, sending reminders for people who are submitting proposals. We are sending reminders for people who are expired. And then between Huron and Maestro systems, we are sending information back and forth to make sure that those disclosures are up to date. That is part of our due diligence. All right. And then the second area of my topics today is conflict of commitment. And so conflict of commitment is very similar to conflict of interest. And this is one of the reasons why we started having staff members fill out disclosure profiles in addition to researchers, because it has to do with any external activity that you have going on. So, if you are a staff member and you have a second job on the weekends or at night, that could inhibit you from doing your daily tasks at your job at TAMU. And so HR felt like we needed to know about that. And so when you have two competing factors in your life, then conflict can be present and it needs to be managed. So conflicts of commitment are included in our disclosure profile questions. This is where we have external employment forms. That's what it used to be called. That's what it's still called at a lot of institutions. We now call it a pre-approval request because that's what Huron calls it. But it's basically letting your supervisors and the leadership know that you have a secondary activity going on top of your responsibilities at your job, and just make sure that everything is allowable and that you have permission to do it. If you're falling asleep at your job every single day and your boss doesn't know that you work nights, that could affect your performance evaluation. But if you had permission for it ahead of time, then you mitigate the risks of that conflict of commitment. And so you may be wondering what export controls and COI have to do with one another. Lauren talked about shipping and travel and collaborations, and then I switched gears and addressed financial conflicts. But increasingly, there have been concerns that foreign adversaries could use the well-intended nature of open research for their benefit. And so areas where there are international activities seems like a logical place where you could find concerns. However, with the evolution of investigations into IP theft and other nefarious activities, it was repeatedly found that there was failure to disclose properly. So when I first started in this job, there was a lot of discussion about how foreign adversaries were stealing intellectual property. And while you do see cases every once in a while that make the news and there's criminal activity, that's not the majority of the problem. The majority of the problem was that people had these side activities, they had outside things, they had, maybe labs that they didn't tell their university about. Publications would come out and the federal sponsors would say, hey, University XYZ, did you know that your professor published with these people, had these research activities going on with these people? And 9 times out of 10, the universities did not know. And so that failure to disclose became such a real problem that the whole process for conflicts of interest had to be expanded. And so, so many things were going unreported that it made the rules have to be strengthened so that we could be catching these things. And so foreign influence is defined by the FBI as covert actions by foreign governments to influence US political sentiment or public discourse. But in an academic setting, that usually is talking about conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment, diversion of intellectual property, sharing of confidential information during peer review. And so none of those are good for us. And so we want to make sure we mitigate the risks. And so federal sponsors are concerned about undisclosed sources of funding. And so all of these things are now being specifically addressed in many people's disclosure processes, including ours. And then in Texas, we have these extra rules that were set in place by the governor talking about, foreign talent recruitment programs and acceptance of gifts and those kinds of things. So all of those touch on the disclosure process and how foreign governments could be impacting US research. So again, as I said, when they knew there was a risk, they made more rules. And so NSPM 33 is one of the latest regulations that's come about, this Chips and Science Act. And so research security is now what you'll hear people talking about. And that's the name change for our office, research security. And it just refers to safeguarding the US research enterprise against the misappropriation of research and development to the detriment of national or economic security, related violations of research integrity and foreign government interference. So we have to follow all the rules, and we didn't just make them up. They came from the federal government. One of the things that was mentioned on the last slide is malign foreign talent recruitment programs. And this is another area where foreign adversary governments were reaching out and offering money, all kinds of benefits. But then they had these requirements, I guess the best way you could put it, that, if you want this money, here's the things you have to do. And so if someone has an agreement with some outside entity that say, they can't end, you can't ever get out of this contract, or you have to recruit people, or you have to omit acknowledgement of your US home institution when you do your publications, those kinds of things. It makes it malign. And then it also has to be from a country of concern or an entity that's based in a country of concern. And then we would start looking into it and find out, because there are talent recruitment programs that are not necessarily malign. And so if it meets all of these definitions, then we would need to address it, because we cannot have our people participating in these kinds of programs. And then the last slide that I have is just in general, because once again, when we find that people have failure to disclose, they often touch on research misconduct in other areas. And so research misconduct is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, reviewing research, or in reporting research results. Research misconduct does not include honest error or differences in interpretations or judgment of data, nor does it include other forms of misconduct such as sexual harassment, misuse of funds, gross negligence in a person's professional activities, etc. Once again, that failure to disclose often is because people are just skirting the rules. You know, people who speed on the freeway likely don't use their blinkers. They may or may not have their seatbelt on. And so when someone has a failure to disclose and it's a repeated pattern, then we start to look into their research misconduct also, and vice versa. If you are somebody who, you know, maybe is a little bit fudging on your research results, then there's a likelihood that you're not telling your institution and your federal sponsors the full story. And so our office is here to help protect the government, the PIs, the institution from all of these things. And so at a recent conference, it was mentioned quite a few times that it's difficult to prove overt IP theft or criminal activity a lot of times. And even with increased disclosure requirements, there are still some gaps in safeguarding our research. And so one of the areas we are strongly encouraged to take note is research misconduct. And so anytime there are ethical issues, there's probably security issues as well. So that's one of the reasons that we have RCR training, is to make sure that we are addressing that through that avenue as well. So we thank you very much for coming today.